water took everything, 40 years of memories, washed away in a single night. I stood on what was left of my porch, holding a single photo album, thinking the worst was over. I was wrong. The real storm wasn't the flood. It was the phone call I made next. "I know, Mom, but we're just so busy right now. Are you sure you can't find a shelter?" My name is Louise Mercer. I am 62 years old, and 2 months ago I lost everything but my heartbeat. My husband died 5 years back, and I thought that was the worst pain I'd ever carry. But grief has layers, and betrayal, especially when it comes from your own blood, cuts far deeper. I survived widowhood. I survived loneliness. I even survived the flood that ripped through Riverbend Street like an angry hand. But what I did not see coming was my daughter turning her back. Before the storm, I had a simple life, the kind of quiet that smells like cinnamon toast and old books. My house was small, but mine filled with 40 years of laughter and loss. After Harold passed, I kept the lights on literally and figuratively. I volunteered at the church pantry. I sent Jane casseroles when she was too busy to cook. I didn't ask for much, just to be remembered. Then the water came. First the driveway disappeared, then the porch. I stood in ankle-deep water as family photo albums floated past like dead leaves. My wedding dress bloomed open like a drowning flower before the current took it. When Jane offered to take me in, I mistook her tone for stress. Maybe it was the baby, I thought, or the mortgage. I told myself it would pass, but deep down I knew. I saw it in the way she cleared her throat before she said yes, in the way her husband Todd barely nodded hello when I arrived. I moved into her guest room with 3 garbage bags and a heart full of guilt. I told myself it was temporary, just until I could get my footing. But sometimes the real disaster doesn't come with thunder or wind. Sometimes it lives under your own child's roof. Before the flood, my life moved in gentle, quiet loops. I woke up each morning at 6:30, poured myself a cup of weak coffee, and sat by the front window to watch the sun warm the azaleas Harold and I planted 30 years ago. I did the crossword with a mechanical pencil, never ink, in case I messed up. Mondays were for laundry, Thursdays for meatloaf, Sundays for church. I liked it that way. Predictable. Steady. After Harold passed, people kept telling me I was strong. I didn't feel strong. I felt empty. But I smiled baked lemon bars and joined a quilting circle, even though I hated sewing. You learn to adapt when you're alone. You shape your life around the silence so it doesn't swallow you whole. Jane would call sometimes, usually when she needed advice or a recipe or someone to vent to about Todd's long hours. I always picked up. Always. Even if I was elbows deep in dishwater or halfway through a book. Because that's what mothers do. We make space. The house was old, but it held me together. Harold's tools hung neatly in the garage, untouched but not forgotten. His flannel shirts still lined the closet. I couldn't bear to donate them. Each one was a thread tying me to the life we built. I didn't have much money, but I got by. Social Security and a little savings. I clipped coupons. I paid the bills on time. I made do. No one really checked in on me unless the church needed volunteers. But I was okay with that. There's a kind of peace in being invisible. Until the flood. Until I became someone with nowhere to go and too much history to pack into 3 bags. The first cracks didn't sound like thunder. They whispered. It started small. Jane began locking her bedroom door when she left for work, even though I'd never once stepped foot in there. The coffee was suddenly labeled for Todd only. My yogurt went missing, replaced by almond milk I didn't ask for. Todd started parking in the driveway where I used to sit to catch the morning light. "I didn't mean it that way," Jane would say every time I flinched at her tone. "It's just different now, Mom. We have our routines. Different." That word hung in the air like mildew after the flood. At dinner, I learned to make myself small. I listened more than I spoke. I offered to cook, but Jane said their diet had changed too many carbs, too much sodium in my meals. So I cleaned the dishes instead, scrubbed the sink, folded their laundry with the same hands that once swaddled Jane in baby blankets. Sometimes I'd walk into a room and both of them would go quiet. Jane always recovered quickly, smiled, asked about my day, but her eyes told a different story. Todd didn't bother pretending. His jaw tightened every time I asked him anything at all. They never said it outright. But I could feel it in the silence, in the side glances, in the way my presence interrupted the flow of their lives. I had become the pothole in their perfectly paved road. I told myself it was hormones. Jane was 6 months pregnant after all. Maybe she was tired. Maybe Todd was stressed about money. Maybe it was all in my head. That's the trick about whispers, they make you question your own ears. But I knew something had shifted. I could feel the ground softening beneath me again. And this time there was no levee to hold back what was coming. It wasn't long before the questions began. "Did you leave the fridge open again, Mom?" Jane called out one afternoon, holding a soggy carton of eggs. I hadn't. I was sure of it. But she sounded so certain, so casual, that I second-guessed myself. Then it was the thermostat. Todd insisted I kept turning it up too high even though I hadn't touched it. I started writing down the temperature every morning just to prove I wasn't imagining things. But no one asked to see my notes. "I think maybe you're just a little overwhelmed," Jane said one night, gently, like she was handling a skittish animal. "You've been through a lot." That part was true. I had been through a lot. But that didn't mean I couldn't tell whether a door was open or closed. It didn't mean I forgot which groceries I bought. Still, her voice was so soft, so reasonable, it made me feel ridiculous for protesting. One morning, I came back from a walk and found my bag moved from the corner where I always kept it. Inside, the small pill organizer I used for my blood pressure meds was open, the capsules jumbled. "I didn't touch it," Jane said when I asked. Maybe I left it open. Maybe I forgot. I began to retreat more. I read the same pages of a mystery novel over and over, the words blurring. I skipped lunch some days, afraid to eat something that wasn't for me. My steps grew lighter, my voice quieter. The woman I used to be, opinionated, organized, stubborn, even began slipping away like floodwater through floorboards. And the worst part, I started thinking maybe they were right. Maybe I was too old, too tired, too fragile. Maybe I should be grateful just to have a roof over my head, even if it came with a side of doubt. That's the thing about gaslighting. You don't feel the fire. You just slowly forget what warm used to be. The day Jane told me about the storage unit, her voice was coated in honey. "I thought it might help," she said, placing a hand gently on my shoulder. "You've got so many things, Mom. We just don't have space here." She'd already rented it, apparently. A 10 by 10 box on the edge of town. Said it would keep my things safe and dry. Said it would make me feel less crowded. I didn't argue. I didn't even ask what she packed. I just nodded. I found out later she hadn't taken much, just what fit in a few bins. The rest was donated, tossed, or left behind in the garage to warp in the humidity. Old papers mostly, she said when I asked. Nothing important, but there was. Harold's journals, a photo of me and my sister at the county fair, a stack of birthday cards from the years Jane still called me Mommy. I told myself they were just things, but they weren't. They were anchors, proof that I had lived, loved, and mattered. The worst part wasn't losing them. It was the way Jane smiled and told me she'd done me a favor, like she was saving me from myself, like I should be grateful she'd cleaned up the past I hadn't been ready to let go of. That night, I cried quietly in the guest room, not because of the boxes, but because I realized I'd stopped correcting her. I'd stopped defending myself. Little by little, she had convinced me I didn't need my own memories, that I didn't know what was best for me, that my life was too big, too cluttered, too inconvenient to fit into hers. I stared at the ceiling and wondered what would disappear next. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of gray, humid day where everything sticks to your skin, including shame. Jane had just come back from an OB appointment, glowing with that serene, expectant light pregnant women sometimes carry. I had folded her laundry that morning, wiped down the counters, and even baked zucchini bread, her favorite. I thought maybe today would feel normal. She walked past me without a word, her keys hitting the bowl by the door with a clatter. Then she turned back. "Mom," she said, smoothing a wrinkle in her blouse. "I've been thinking, once the baby comes, We're really going to need the space. I blinked. What do you mean? Her eyes didn't soften. I mean, maybe it's time to consider a shelter, just for a while, until you get back on your feet. I felt the words before I fully heard them, a pressure in my chest like something caved inward. A shelter, me, after everything. I opened my mouth, but nothing came, not even tears. She kept talking. About how Todd needed his office back, about how the baby needed a nursery, about how the arrangement was always temporary. Temporary. That word again. I looked down at my hands, still damp from folding her towels, and thought about the woman I used to be. The one who saved for her college, who stayed up through her fevers, who held her hand during her divorce. Okay, I whispered. Not because I agreed, not because I had a plan, but because I couldn't bear to hear her say one more thing. Because in that moment I realized the flood hadn't taken everything. Jane was still here, and she was still taking. I didn't pack that night. I just sat on the edge of the bed staring at the pale blue walls that were never really mine. The air in the room felt tight, like it too wanted me gone. In the morning, Jane placed a grocery bag on the dresser. Just some essentials, she said. Toothpaste, tissues, a bus schedule printed from the internet. She didn't say the word homeless. She didn't have to. I called 3 shelters that afternoon. One was full. One didn't answer. The last one said they had a cot, but only for 72 hours. My stomach turned. I'd never thought to imagine my life on a countdown. When Todd came home, he didn't say anything, just avoided my eyes and walked straight into the kitchen. I heard the click of the fridge, the clink of glass, then the murmur of their voices behind a closed door. Dinner wasn't offered, so I boiled a packet of instant oatmeal in the microwave and ate it standing up. I didn't taste a thing. That night I opened the box of things I had managed to save from the flood. Just a few photos, some letters, and Harold's old watch, its leather strap still smelling faintly of cedar. I held it in my palm and let the weight of it anchor me. It was the only thing in the room that felt real. I lay in bed with my shoes on, afraid I wouldn't have the strength to put them on in the morning. Outside the window, the sprinkler hissed to life, watering the lawn. Jane once made me promise not to step on. At 3 a.m, I sat up suddenly, my chest aching, like I'd been holding my breath for weeks. I whispered into the dark, "What happened to my life?" No one answered. The next morning, I walked to the park. I told Jane I needed air, though she barely nodded. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that presses against your skin. I found a bench near the duck pond and sat there until my back ached. I watched mothers pushing strollers, couples walking dogs, people with errands and lives to return to. No one looked at me. No one saw the woman whose house had washed away, whose daughter had quietly asked her to disappear. By noon, I felt dizzy. I hadn't eaten since the oatmeal. I reached into my purse for a butterscotch candy I kept for emergencies. My hands trembled. A woman in a nurse's uniform sat beside me to tie her shoes. I turned toward her, opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. She smiled politely, then left. I felt foolish like a ghost, trying to speak through fog. Back at the house, Jane was on the phone pacing. She lowered her voice when I walked in. "She's still here," I heard her say. Then louder, "Oh, hey, Mom. Everything okay?" I nodded. I spent the rest of the day in the guest room staring at the ceiling. I tried to pray, but the words felt hollow. I tried to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Despair doesn't always scream. Sometimes it sits beside you in silence, pressing its weight on your chest like an unwanted guest who never leaves. I looked at the bus schedule Jane had printed. Shelter names, departure times, a map with dotted lines. My name wasn't on any of it, but somehow I knew I was already on my way. That night I dreamed of Harold standing in our old kitchen, the light golden and warm. He was smiling, reaching out. But I couldn't move. My feet were stuck in water, rising fast around my ankles. I woke up gasping, still dry, still alone. The first thing I gave up was the mirror. I stopped looking at my reflection. Not out of vanity, but out of self-preservation. My face no longer looked like mine. It was tired, shrunken, and uncertain. My hair, once salt and pepper thick, now hung limp in a bun I couldn't be bothered to fix. My eyes, once quick to scan crosswords and price tags, stared back dull and unfamiliar. I stopped watching my favorite morning show. Jane said the volume bothered her during work calls, so I unplugged the television and tucked the remote into the drawer. I told her I preferred quiet. That was a lie. I began skipping meals, not out of protest, but to make things simpler. I'd brew a weak cup of tea and nibble on crackers in my room while the smell of garlic and butter drifted in from the kitchen. They never asked if I'd eaten. I never offered that I hadn't. One night I overheard Jane and Todd arguing. Something about nursery, paint colors, budgets, and me. Always me. "She's not trying to be a problem," Jane said. "I know," Todd snapped, "but she is one." The door clicked shut, and their voices faded. I sat in the dark and folded socks that didn't belong to me. I lined up baby onesies by color. I vacuumed corners no one saw. I tried to earn space by taking up less of it. I gave up asking questions, gave up the smell of cinnamon toast in the morning. Gave up the only framed photo I had of Harold and me together. I'd left it behind in the old house, and it haunted me more than anything else. Every day I traded pieces of myself for permission to stay, and every night I wondered how much of me would be left when they finally told me to go. It was the baby shower that broke me. Jane asked me to stay out of sight for the afternoon. "Not because of you," she said, "but because it's mostly Todd's coworkers, and you don't really know them. It'll be less awkward." I nodded as if the idea didn't gut me. I had sewn the pink bunting myself from fabric scraps, ordered cupcakes with buttercream roses, polished every silver fork, and now I was to vanish like a stagehand behind the curtain. I spent the day in the laundry room with a folding chair and a worn book I couldn't focus on. The walls thumped with laughter. I heard clinking glasses and the pop of champagne. I thought maybe someone would peek and hand me a plate. No one did. I told myself it was fine, that this was what mothers do. They make things beautiful for others. They disappear so their children can shine. When the party ended, Jane came in, smiling, cheeks flushed. "It went really well," she said, not seeing the way I'd traced Harold's name into the dust on the dryer. Later that night, as I washed dishes alone, I found the baby shower guest book sitting closed on the counter. I opened it, page after page of notes, blessings, advice, and on the last page, written in looping cursive, I didn't recognize, "She will be lucky to have a mother like you." I stared at the words until my vision blurred. I'd spent years being a mother, and somehow in Jane's eyes, I no longer was one. That night I made a decision. Not the kind you write down or announce, the quiet kind, the kind that reshapes the outline of your soul. I would let go of the need to be seen. I would stop waiting for space to be offered. I would become my own shelter. There's a toll no one talks about when you live beneath someone else's roof. It's not just about space. It's about shrinking your voice, your habits, your memories. I stopped humming when I washed dishes. I stopped reading at the table. I even stopped saying goodnight. Too often I'd knock gently on Jane's door and hear, "Can it wait, Mom?" So I waited. I waited through her doctor appointments, through her baby classes, through the late-night arguments muffled behind drywall. I waited for a moment when she might look at me and remember who I was before I became her problem. And while I waited, things slipped. My knees hurt more. My memory, once so sharp, dulled at the edges. I mixed up dates, forgot where I left things. Once I couldn't remember my own Social Security number and felt my throat close around the panic. "You're just tired," Jane said. She didn't mean it cruelly, but I could see the fear in her eyes, the suspicion that maybe I was fading. I started keeping a notebook. Scribbled down everything, what I ate, who I called, what I overheard. Not because I was losing my mind, but because I feared someone might try to convince me I was. I felt the cost in my bones, in the way my back curled from crouching in corners, in the way my mouth stayed closed even when I had something to say, in the way I apologized for the noise, the light, the space I occupied. The cost wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the quiet erosion of identity. One sigh at a time, one closed door at a time. By the time Jane handed me a brochure for a transitional housing program, I didn't even react. I just held it in my lap like a receipt for a debt I never meant to owe. The discovery came by accident, wrapped in dust and memory. Todd had asked me to clear out the rest of my things from the garage. He needed the space for baby storage, he said. I didn't ask what that meant. I just nodded and got to work. Among the half-crushed boxes and rusted paint cans, I found a small metal container about the size of a loaf of bread, heavy, sealed tight. I recognized it instantly. Harold's. He used to keep important things in there. Documents, spare keys, old letters. The kind of box you forget until everything else is gone. My hands shook as I pried it open. Inside, a Ziploc bag of photos, a stack of savings bonds, and something else. A letter, yellowed at the edges, folded 3 times. It was from Aunt Tilly. I hadn't thought of her in years. She and Harold were always close, but she moved out west after her husband died. Quiet, eccentric, and fiercely private. I'd sent her a Christmas card 5 years ago and never heard back. The letter was addressed to me, the handwriting slanted and familiar. Louise, it began, if you're reading this, something's happened. I'm sorry I never got to say goodbye in person. I left something for you, something Harold helped me arrange. I didn't trust banks. Enclosed is a copy of the will and the number of my lawyer in Modesto. This is yours, and you'll need it someday. I sat back, breath caught in my throat. Beneath the letter, folded carefully, was a will. Not mine, not Harold's, Tilly's, and on the last page in bold letters, beneficiary Louise Mercer. For the first time in weeks, my heartbeat didn't sound like retreat. It sounded like a beginning. I didn't tell Jane about the letter. Not that night, not the next morning. Something inside me told me to hold it close, like a match I wasn't ready to strike. I slipped the will and lawyer's card into the lining of my purse, tucked between a mint and a packet of tissues. The silence between Jane and me had grown so wide by then it could hold oceans. She barely spoke, except to ask when I planned to make arrangements. I smiled, politely nodded, but I was no longer shrinking. That night, after they'd gone to bed, I pulled out a notebook and started writing. Questions for the lawyer, names I still remembered from Tilly's side of the family, a list of things I'd need if I left things I'd let Jane slowly take away, independence records, proof of who I used to be. I jotted them down like a woman planning a rescue, except this time I was the one in the flood, and this time I would be the one to swim. For the first time in weeks, I stood up straighter. My reflection still looked tired, but there was a spark now, a pulse of something sharp and awake. I wasn't done. I wasn't broken. I had been bruised, yes, folded, pressed down, but not erased. Not yet. I made a vow sitting there in the dim light of the hallway. I would find out what Aunt Tilly left behind. I would call that lawyer. I would reclaim the pieces of myself I'd handed over, one silent apology at a time. Jane had taken my dignity, but I had something she didn't know about. I had a door, and I had a key. The lawyer's name was printed in fading blue ink, Howard Kessler, Modesto, California. It took me 2 days to work up the courage to call. I waited until Jane was out at a prenatal yoga class. Todd was at work. The house for once was quiet. I dialed with trembling fingers. Howard Kessler's office, a woman's voice answered. I cleared my throat. Yes, hello. My name is Louise Mercer. I believe I'm listed as a beneficiary on a will filed by Matilda Bauer. She was my aunt. There was a pause, paper shuffling, a clicking keyboard. Oh, she finally said. Yes, Ms. Mercer. We've actually been trying to locate you for years. You're listed as the sole beneficiary. Do you have a moment to speak with Mr. Kessler Years? My heart beat so loud I could barely hear the hold music. When the lawyer got on the line, his voice was warm, careful. He explained that Aunt Tilly had passed away 3 years ago, and the will had named me her sole heir. The estate included a cottage in Groveland near Yosemite, some land, a modest investment account that had grown surprisingly well. She didn't want any fuss, he said, but she was very clear about wanting it to go to you. I sat in stunned silence, clutching the phone like it might float away. I didn't know, I whispered. You do now, he said gently. And everything's still in your name. Taxes are up to date. We've just been waiting for you. Waiting. All this time I'd been waiting to be seen, to be remembered. And there in a box of forgotten paper was proof someone still had. I hung up the phone and stared out the window at Jane's hydrangeas blooming along the fence line. Something had just shifted. I didn't know what came next, but for the first time in a long time, I was the one holding the map. That night, I pulled out one of the old photo albums Jane hadn't thrown away yet and found a picture of Aunt Tilly. She was standing on a porch holding a glass of lemonade, her hair pinned back with a pencil. Her laugh lived in the photograph, wide, unbothered, sharp around the edges. Tilly had always been different from the other women in our family. She didn't apologize for her independence. She wore bold lipstick and paid in cash. When Harold and I were newlyweds, we visited her in Groveland. I remembered the smell of pine, the chipped paint on her porch swing, the way she poured Harold 2 fingers of bourbon and told me with a wink, "Money only controls you if you let it." I had forgotten how much she mattered to me. Harold admired her, trusted her. They used to trade letters, the old-fashioned kind ink on paper, sealed with care. I found some in the bottom of the metal box, along with copies of land surveys receipts for property tax and a small red notebook. Inside the notebook were notes in Harold's handwriting plans, reminders, and a single page with circled words, "Deed transfer complete." Keys at Tilly's old office. Lawyer confirmed. Louise will need this. I ran my finger over his name, the indentation still strong after all these years. He'd known. He'd helped arrange it. While I was keeping the lights on and tending to casseroles and quiet rooms, Harold had helped secure a piece of freedom I never thought I'd have again. It wasn't just land, it wasn't just money. It was dignity wrapped in cedar and sealed by people who had loved me in ways I hadn't recognized until now. Jane had her nursery, but I had something else. A home, a legacy, a weapon shaped like a second chance. The next morning, before the sun had fully crested the rooftops, I made the call. Howard Kessler answered on the second ring. "Ms. Mercer," he said warmly, "I was hoping to hear from you again. I want to come see the property," I said. My voice trembled, but not from fear, from possibility. "Of course," he replied. "We can arrange everything. Do you have a way to get to Groveland?" I glanced at the bus schedule still pinned to the fridge, the same one Jane had printed weeks ago, meant to usher me into a shelter. I smiled. "Yes, I think I do." We set a date, the following Thursday. He'd meet me at the old post office in town. He said the place had been locked up but well kept. "Tilly took pride in what she left behind," he added. I spent the next few days quietly preparing. I gathered documents, made copies of IDs, tucked the lawyer's number in 3 different places. I packed a change of clothes and a small notebook filled with every question I could think of. I told Jane I had a doctor's appointment. She didn't ask which doctor. She just nodded and said, "Don't be late. Todd has a thing and I need the car back." I didn't plan on coming back. As I zipped my purse closed that morning, I looked around the guest room one last time. It had never felt like mine. The pale walls, the stiff bed, the closet with nothing in it but air and expectation. But now my hand held more than just a bus ticket. It held direction. It held choice. Jane thought I was leaving with nothing. But I was leaving with the one thing she had never seen coming, a plan. Groveland was quiet when I arrived. A town made of wood and stone, smelling faintly of pine and chimney smoke. It felt like it belonged to a slower time, one where people still waved to each other from porches. Howard Kessler was waiting outside the post office, a man in his 70s with kind eyes and a tweed jacket that had seen many seasons. He shook my hand like someone who believed in eye contact. We sat on a bench and went over the papers. The deed was clear. Tilly had left me the cottage and the land outright, no loans, no liens. The property taxes were low, grandfathered in from the 70s. The investment account had grown to just under $62,000. "It's all yours, Louise," he said. "Tilly wanted you to have something no one could take away." I felt tears sting, but I blinked them back. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" "We tried," he said gently. "Letters were returned, numbers disconnected. But she believed you'd find your way eventually." I looked at the cottage keys in my palm. They felt heavier than metal. They felt like a spine straightening. We drew up a power of attorney document, updated my contact information, filed a request for official copies of the will. Howard slid the manila folder across the table. "You're protected now. No one can speak for you. No one can push you out. You have something permanent." I left his office holding that folder like armor. Jane had offered me a roof with strings. Tilly had given me roots with no conditions. The investment account was modest, but to me it felt like a fortress. Howard walked me through every line: mutual funds, a municipal bond from 1993, a small dividend that paid quarterly. Tilly was cautious, he said, but deliberate. She wanted this to last. I opened a checking account in Groveland that same day, put the folder in a safety deposit box, had new checks printed with my name, my address, my real address. The next morning I called Social Security and updated my records, then the DMV, then Medicare. Every call, every change was a brick in a wall I didn't realize I was rebuilding. By noon, I'd drafted a simple will of my own, left the cottage to a women's shelter in town, left a note with it too, to help another woman who had to start again from nothing. I wasn't rich, but I wasn't powerless, and that was the difference. I used the funds to repair the plumbing, replace the locks, and repaint the shutters in a soft blue that reminded me of Harold's eyes. I bought a new mattress, stocked the fridge, paid for a small storage pod to ship what few belongings Jane hadn't thrown away. Each dollar I spent wasn't about comfort, it was about control, about knowing no one could barge in and ask me to leave. No one could question whether I belonged. Money doesn't solve everything, but it does buy a door with a lock, a phone in your own name, a space where your story can unfold without someone else holding the pen. For the first time since the flood, I wasn't surviving. I was securing. I spent the next week preparing not just my new life, but my exit from the old one. Every hour was intentional. I gathered receipts, printed emails, made digital copies of important documents and stored them on a flash drive. I opened a P.O. box in Groveland, forwarded my mail. When the delivery pod arrived from Jane's house, I opened it like a time capsule. My Pyrex dishes, my wedding china 3 plates short, but still there. A few blouses, Harold's flannel, and tucked inside one of his old boots, the photograph of us at the county fair. I pressed it to my chest and let myself cry, not because I was broken, but because I wasn't anymore. With Howard's help, I scheduled a consultation with a local estate planner. I met the woman who ran the town's shelter and dropped off a donation. I called the local church to ask about volunteer hours. Every act was a thread in a net I was quietly building around myself, strong and visible and mine. On Wednesday, I mailed a letter to Jane. Not angry, not dramatic, just clear. Dear Jane, thank you for your hospitality. I found a permanent home and am settling in well. Please don't worry about me. I'm okay. Love, Mom. No return address, no phone number, just a gentle closing to a chapter that had already ended, even if she hadn't noticed. That evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the air scented with pine and rain. I had nothing left to retrieve, nothing left to prove. Only one thing remained, the quiet before the storm that would not be mine. It happened faster than I expected. The letter must have arrived Thursday morning because by Friday evening, Jane called. I let it ring. Then again, and again. Finally, I picked up. Mom. Her voice was a mixture of confusion and something else, an edge I hadn't heard in weeks. Where are you? I'm safe, I said. I sent a letter. I got it, she replied. But where exactly is this permanent home? I said nothing. You didn't even say goodbye. I let out a breath. Jane, you said it yourself. This arrangement was temporary. There was silence. I didn't mean for you to just disappear. But you did mean for me to leave, I said, my voice calm. And now I have. You could have said something. I had no idea you were planning things. Neither did I said, until I remembered who I was. She was quiet for a long time. Then, is someone helping you? I smiled. Yes. Me. Another pause. Then her voice tight. Well, I hope it works out. I know it will. We said goodbye, the words stretched like old elastic. Not quite broken, but never snapping back, I stood at the kitchen sink after looking out at the woods, my tea cooling beside me. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, like someone who had finally set down a heavy bag she didn't realize she'd been carrying. There would be no going back. Not because I couldn't, because I wouldn't. That phone call wasn't the start of a new chapter. It was the closing of a door, and I was the one who turned the key. Todd called first. I didn't expect it. His name lit up my phone like a warning flare. For a moment, I almost didn't answer, but something in me wanted to hear it, wanted to witness what panic sounded like coming from his voice. "Louise?" He started far too friendly. "Jane's been worried. We both have." "I sent a letter," I said simply. Right. Of course," he said quickly. "It's just, this new place, do you have everything you need?" I let the silence sit between us. "We're trying to sort through some paperwork." He continued, his tone tightening. "We realized some of your documents, old tax records, property things, were mixed in with ours." There it was. "You'll have to be more specific," I replied. He hesitated. "We were looking at your old Social Security documents. Jane thought maybe we could help set up your retirement accounts better." "They're set," I said. "I've updated everything. All records are now under my new address." A pause. "New address," he echoed. "You moved permanently?" "Yes." His voice dipped lower. "Look, I don't know what Jane said, but we weren't trying to push you out." "Todd," I said gently but firmly, "this isn't about blame. I'm fine, really." Okay, he said slowly. "But just so you know, the guest room is still there. If anything changes, it won't." When I hung up, I didn't feel cruel. I felt clear. That call wasn't about concern. It was about control slipping through fingers that thought they held the leash. The first domino had tipped, and the rest, they were already trembling. Jane called the next morning, not to ask how I was, not to apologize. She wanted to know about the lawyer. "Mom," she began, voice clipped, "did you talk to someone? A lawyer out in Groveland?" "Yes," I said. "Howard Kessler." There was a beat of silence. "I saw a notification from the USPS your mail forwarding went through, and Todd said you mentioned a will." I said nothing. I could hear her breathing through her nose, quick and shallow. "Why would you need a lawyer?" she asked. "To finalize the property transfer," I replied. "Aunt Tilly left me something. Harold helped set it up years ago." She didn't speak. Not at first. "Then, so you have a house?" "I do. And money enough." Her voice changed, softened, but not with kindness. With calculation. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I needed time to know it was mine." A pause. Then a faint laugh, brittle as glass. "You've been here for months, and now suddenly you have a secret estate?" "No, Jane. I had nothing. And now finally I have something, and I don't owe anyone an explanation for surviving, but you could have stayed. You could have. I wasn't welcome." Another silence, this one longer. "I was just overwhelmed," she said quietly. "With the baby coming, with everything. I know," I said, "and I don't hold anger, but I also don't belong to you. Not anymore." Her breath caught. I imagined her standing in the kitchen, the same place she told me to find a shelter. This time it was her turn to feel displaced. The second domino fell not with noise, but with weight. They showed up on a Sunday. No call, no warning. Just Jane and Todd on my porch looking out of place among the pine trees and cracked stone path. I stepped outside before they could knock. They were standing stiffly, arms crossed, eyes scanning the property like they were appraising it. "Nice place," Todd said, forcing a smile. "It is," I replied. "What brings you up this way?" "We were in the area," Jane said quickly. "That was a lie. Groveland wasn't on the way to anything. I got your letter," she continued, trying to sound casual. "And I just thought we should talk in person." I gestured to the porch chairs. They sat, but not comfortably. I remained standing. "Is this all really yours?" she asked, nodding toward the cottage. "The land, the account, everything." Yes. I guess I just don't understand why you didn't tell us sooner. I met her eyes. Because I didn't think you'd care. Not until it became inconvenient that I had something of my own. Todd shifted. That's not fair. No, I said. What wasn't fair was being asked to find a shelter while folding your laundry. Jane flinched. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I'm not here to shame you, I added. But I won't let you rewrite what happened either. We were overwhelmed, she said softly. So was I. Todd stood. We just wanted to make sure you're okay. I am. They left without another word. When their car disappeared down the gravel road, I felt something ease inside me. Not closure, not yet, but the first true step toward it. It began with whispers. Jane's voice on the other end of a call I didn't answer. Then a voicemail, thin and reedy. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't realize it would get this complicated. Then came the fallout. According to a neighbor who still spoke to me, Mrs. Halpern, kind and nosy as ever, Jane had broken down in tears in her front yard. Something about inheritance, about feeling betrayed, about Todd yelling behind closed doors. They didn't know you had anything, Mrs. Halpern said. They thought you were just used up. Those words sat in my chest like ice. Used up. Todd's firm had denied his request for paternity leave, citing family instability. Somehow word had spread that Jane's mother had been pushed out. The story made its rounds, neighbors talking, friends backing away. And then the nursery. A pipe burst in the ceiling. Mold. Expensive repairs. A contractor who ghosted. They had to dip into savings. I listened. I didn't gloat. But I did not offer help. They called again. This time Jane's voice was sharper. If you just shared this with us sooner, we could have planned better. We needed your help. I tried to be there, I said. You asked me to leave. We were under pressure, she snapped. You have no idea I do, I said calmly. I've lived under pressure my whole life. I just never asked you to carry it for me. There was silence. Then the call ended. The implosion wasn't a single explosion. It was 1,000 tiny fractures in the foundation they'd built on convenience, not care. And now everything they'd leaned on was crumbling. They tried again, but this time it wasn't with pleasantries. A certified letter arrived at my P.O. box. Legal stationery. Polite language dipped in condescension. They were requesting access to Harold's estate records, claiming some of the inheritance might overlap, that certain assets could have been misfiled. Howard reviewed it. Nonsense, he said, flipping through the pages. They have no claim. This was your aunt's estate, separate, clean. Still, I felt the tremor of it. Not fear, just disbelief. That they'd rather try to claw back what they never earned than acknowledge what they'd discarded. The next week, Jane called again. This time she cried. The nursery's ruined. We had to borrow from Todd's parents. Everything's falling apart. And you're just sitting there, like you don't care. I do care, I said quietly, but I also care about myself now. And that's new, she sobbed. Not the delicate kind, the messy, breathless kind. You left me when I needed you. No, I said. You asked me to go when I needed you. Silence. Then, you've changed. I've remembered who I am. After that, they stopped pretending. Emails came from Todd, not Jane. Short, cold. One accused me of manipulation. Another hinted at seeking legal review. I saved every message, forwarded them to Howard, kept records. When people grow desperate, they show you the version of themselves they usually keep behind closed doors. And now all their doors were swinging open. It was Mrs. Halpern again who told me. Jane's house is up for sale, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I saw the sign myself. I blinked, absorbing the words. Already, she nodded. Rumor is the repairs cost more than they thought. Todd missed 2 mortgage payments, and something about his work he's under review. It made sense. The cracks had been showing for weeks. Jane had been juggling too many things, too few hands. Todd had overextended them both. And now the foundation was collapsing, not just metaphorically. I sat on the porch with that news curling in my chest like smoke. Not joy, not revenge, grief. Because I had wanted better for her. Even when she'd treated me like excess. Even when she'd asked me to leave. A mother's ache doesn't evaporate just because her heart was pushed aside. Later that week, a real estate listing popped up online. Photos of the nursery unfinished drywall, torn baby items boxed in corners. The price was far below what they'd paid. Motivated seller, the description read. Motivated by desperation, I thought. She didn't call again, neither did Todd, but the silence this time felt different. Not expectant, not cruel, empty. They were unraveling, and I wasn't at the center of it. I was no longer their scapegoat, their fallback plan, their emotional punching bag disguised as houseguest. The financial ruin wasn't about numbers. It was about the cost of treating someone as disposable, only to realize too late she was the one thing holding the structure up. It started with a dropped invite. Jane wasn't at the neighborhood brunch. Then she wasn't at the baby boutique opening. Then someone from her church group stopped by Mrs. Halpern's to ask casually if Jane was doing all right. The silence was growing around her. People talk, especially in suburban circles where reputation is currency. Whispers turned into commentary. Jane had pushed her widowed mother out during a flood, then sued her, then lost. I didn't spread those stories. I didn't have to. The truth has a way of finding its own feet. Todd's co-workers stopped inviting him to weekend barbecues. Jane's name was quietly removed from the women's club mailing list. She posted less online. When she did, the captions were vague, the comments sparse. I just feel erased, she had said once when I was still living there. Now it was happening in real time. I watched it from a distance, not out of vengeance, but out of awe. How fast the world forgets those who only perform kindness when it's convenient. She had built a life on curated warmth, perfect photos, the right donations, the illusion of balance. But foundations built on image collapse under scrutiny. By the time the baby was born, few showed up for the shower redo. A handful of gifts arrived by mail. No one brought casseroles. No one offered to help. The social safety net she'd once felt so secure in had frayed at every knot. Because when you burn the bridge that raised you, you often forget who else was watching from the shore. Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the porch railing. The air held that sharp quiet only cold can bring. I hadn't heard from Jane in weeks. No calls, no messages, just silence. Then, on a Monday morning, a letter arrived. Not typed, handwritten, slanted like she'd written it in one sitting fast, afraid she'd change her mind. Mom, I don't know how to fix what I did. I don't even know if I should try. But I wanted to say I'm sorry. I was scared of money, of the baby, of turning into someone who needed help. But I became someone worse. I see that now. There was more about Todd, about the house, about how nothing felt steady anymore. She ended it with, "You don't have to write back. I just wanted you to know." I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer beside my tea bags. I didn't cry. I didn't call. Forgiveness isn't always about rushing back. Sometimes it's about letting the silence settle into truth. Jane wasn't just isolated from her neighbors now. She was isolated from herself, from the version of her that believed she'd always have the upper hand, from the woman who once thought dignity was disposable. I walked through the cottage that evening, touching the walls, the bookshelves, the edges of my reclaimed life. The kettle whistled softly. The trees swayed in the wind. I wasn't lonely. Loneliness is when you're surrounded by people who make you feel invisible. This was peace. And peace, I had learned, is louder than any apology spoken too late. The first true morning of freedom didn't look like fireworks. It looked like oatmeal on the stove and sunlight filtering through clean windows. I didn't set an alarm. I didn't wait for someone else's footsteps down the hall. I just woke when my body was ready and let the day greet me like an old friend. I walked barefoot through the cottage, the floor cold but familiar beneath my soles. Every creak belonged to me now, every drawer, every chipped mug. No one would ask me to move my things. No one would label food or lock doors. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch. The pine trees bowed gently in the wind. A red bird landed on the railing, cocked its head, and then flew off. It felt like a small benediction. That morning I did something I hadn't done in years. I danced. Not a full waltz or anything graceful, just a slow sway in the middle of the kitchen to an old Patsy Cline song. I closed my eyes and let the music fill the spaces Jane had once tried to shrink. I wasn't performing. I wasn't proving anything. I was simply moving for myself. Later, I journaled, called the woman at the shelter again and offered to volunteer. I repotted a plant Harold had given me years ago that had somehow survived both flood and time. Freedom isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the whisper of a curtain swaying open, the gentle hum of a life being lived without fear of eviction. It was the beginning of something soft, something mine. The first step wasn't leaving Jane's house. It was finally walking into my own. Routine came slowly like a song I once knew but had forgotten the melody. Mornings began with tea, loose leaf steeped properly, not microwaved. I read the local paper on the porch, circled interesting events, and made grocery lists with real meals in mind. For the first time in years, I cooked for pleasure. Roasted squash stews with fresh thyme, cornbread from scratch. I started keeping a planner again, not out of necessity, but out of desire. Monday farmer's market, Wednesday shelter orientation, Friday walk by the lake. Every box filled with something chosen, not assigned. The town welcomed me like warm soup. Strangers smiled. The librarian learned my name. A man at the general store offered to carry my bags without pity in his eyes. Evenings were quiet but rich. I lit candles, played records, sat with a book on my lap and my legs tucked under a handmade quilt. There were no sudden voices behind doors, no rules about thermostats or labeled food, no one timing how long I stayed in the bathroom. Sometimes I still flinched at the creak of the floorboards or the buzz of my phone, but those moments passed more quickly now, like ghosts realizing they no longer had power here. I picked up crocheting again, started a blanket in deep burgundy. I named it Sanctuary. Routines don't just organize life, they stitch together a story. Mine was no longer about survival. It was about reclaiming joy in the mundane. It started with a flyer at the library. Writing circle, Wednesdays at 6 p.m., open to all ages. Bring a pen and an open heart. I almost threw it away. Who was I to write anything? But that night I found myself digging through an old box until I found it a leather-bound journal, mostly empty. A gift from Harold on our 35th anniversary. Inside the cover he had written, "Because your story matters." I brought it to the first meeting. The room was small, tucked behind the stacks of large print books. 5 chairs, 1 folding table, and a mismatched pot of coffee. The others welcomed me without fuss, young and old, some shy, some loud. We read prompts, scribbled responses, and shared if we wanted. I didn't speak the first night, but I listened. The second week I read a paragraph about my front porch after the flood, about the sound of water rising. They listened, really listened. Someone said, "That felt like a memory I'd lived." And something cracked open. I began writing every morning. Not for anyone else, for me. Small scenes, childhood moments, conversations I wish I'd had. I wrote about the scent of Harold's shirts, the ache in my knees, the way Jane's eyes used to light up when she was 5. Writing didn't fix everything, but it gave shape to the things I carried. I wrote myself a new chapter, 1 page at a time. And for the first time since the flood, I stopped feeling like the victim of someone else's story. I was the narrator now. And I had more to say. I didn't write back to Jane right away, but I wrote letters. To friends I hadn't spoken to in years, to cousins scattered across the country, to a woman I'd met once at a grief support group who had shared her address with trembling hands. "Just in case you ever want to talk," she'd said. So I talked. Every week I sent 2 letters, stamped, sealed, handwritten, no emails, no texts, just ink and paper and memory. And slowly they came back. Responses filled my mailbox like autumn leaves, soft, surprising, each one carrying a piece of someone else's life. I learned that my cousin Ellen had retired early and taken up birdwatching, that my old church friend Margaret was raising her grandson, that the woman from the support group still kept Harold's name on her lips when she prayed. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed being known. One Saturday, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside, a photo of Jane as a child, missing teeth clutching a teddy bear, and a short note. "I found this in an old box. Thought you might want it." No signature. But I knew her handwriting. I pinned the photo to my fridge. Not as a bridge, not yet. But as a reminder, even the hardest stories have chapters that make us smile. Reaching out didn't mean reopening wounds. It meant stitching together new cloth from the scraps I still had. It meant rebuilding not just a home, but a world. And this time, I was inviting people in. The changes started small. At the shelter, I began leading a journaling workshop on Thursday afternoons. We sat in a circle, women of all ages, all histories, and wrote without judgment. Some scribbled, some wept. Some stared at blank pages until words finally came. One woman, Marcia, hadn't spoken a full sentence in weeks. Then one day she read aloud a story about her childhood cat. The room held its breath. When she finished, everyone clapped. Not loud, just enough to make her eyes shine. The ripple had started. At church, the pastor asked if I'd speak during a service about second chances. I hesitated, then agreed. I stood at the lectern with trembling hands and talked about water loss and the strange grace of being brought low enough to start again. Afterward, a man stopped me outside. "I thought my story was over," he said. "Maybe it's just changing chapters." Neighbors dropped off cookies. One offered to repaint my shutters. Another brought a cutting from their rose bush. Small gestures, but real. Even Mrs. Halpern visited. She brought a scrapbook she'd started. "In case you ever want to add your chapter," she said. And I did. Healing doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through shared pens and passed down recipes, through notes on a fridge and hands folded in silent prayer. I didn't fix the world, but I had created a circle in it, and within that circle things were growing. I waited until spring. The snow had melted. The daffodils were blooming along the fence line. The air was soft again. It felt like the right time. I sat at my kitchen table with a fresh sheet of paper and a pen that wrote smooth and steady. No drafts, no hesitations, just truth. Dear Jane, I've thought about you often, about who we were, about what we became. I've asked myself what I could have done differently, what you might have needed, what I missed, and what I allowed. There is pain between us. I don't deny it. But there is also love buried deep beneath the rubble. And if someday you want to find it again, I'll meet you there. Not as someone dependent, not as someone disposable, but as a woman who has rebuilt, a woman who has learned, a mother still but whole on her own. With care, Mom. I folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. No return address, just my name. I walked it to the post office myself. There was no shaking hand this time, no tightness in my chest. Just a peace that came from saying what needed saying and letting the rest be. The letter was not a key. It was not an invitation. It was a final marker, a moment in time where I could say with full breath, "Here is where the old story ends, and the rest is entirely mine." Peace didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly like morning fog, lifting over the hills, revealing what had always been there beneath the quiet. I found it in the rhythm of sweeping the porch, in the weight of a fresh library book, in the sound of rain tapping the windows and the warmth of tea against my palms. No one asked where I was going. No one timed how long I stayed. My days unfolded like chapters without deadlines. Sometimes I wrote, sometimes I didn't. Sometimes I walked the trail behind the cottage and talked to Harold out loud. Not expecting answers, just honoring the way his presence still lived in pine needles and cool wind. I started planting again. Tomatoes, lavender, a stubborn rosemary bush that refused to die. The garden grew unevenly, wildly, like me. Neighbors waved, friends called. I belonged. I wasn't just surviving loss. I was building something from it. And in the middle of that soft, sturdy life, I found a truth I hadn't been ready to believe before. Not everyone who leaves takes something with them. Sometimes they make space for you to return to yourself. One evening, as the sky blushed gold and the world quieted around me, I stood at the threshold of my cottage, the wind lifting the hem of my sweater. No anger, no regret, only this: I was still here, and I was finally home.